may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. You may be seated. In 1729, the Oxford Club was founded by brothers Charles and John Wesley. The club was an opportunity to combine themselves with the labors of several like-minded friends to pursue sanctification. That is, they wanted to work together, to encourage one another, to ever more fervent piety, devotion, and self-sacrifice in the pursuit of the knowledge and love of God. Very quickly, the club became known pejoratively as the Holiness Club by its critics. Nevertheless, the club became an important source of reform and renewal within churches across Europe and the United States. Charles and John Wesley went on to found a new movement within the Christian tradition that we know today as Methodism. George Whitefield became a powerhouse preacher behind both the evangelical revival in England and the Great Awakening in the American colonies. And when we say powerhouse, we're mostly talking about his lungs. His voice was so booming, Benjamin Franklin ran experiments on it to see how many people could fit within hearing. Unaided and in open air, so no tricks of architecture, Franklin determined that Whitefield would have been able to preach to 30,000 people at one time. Modern acoustics experts estimate, using Franklin's data but deeper autistic analysis, that number could actually have risen to 125,000 people. Either way, that's a lot of people to hear you at one time. The club boasted a future Moravian bishop, prominent Anglican clergy, religious writers, and evangelists. But if you look closely at the lengths the club members went, it's not hard to see why they had their critics. Their meetings began as gatherings for prayer and Bible study. The meetings included weekly reception of the Eucharist, which was incredibly radical in Anglican theology at the time, as surprising as perhaps that is to us to hear now. Their ministry expanded to include visits to prisoners, care for the poor and the elderly, all of which seems perfectly standard by our modern expectations. But their efforts at self-mortification were decidedly more questionable then and now. Attempting to purge their souls of sin and to punish and tame the lusts and passions of their bodies, they often went to extreme measures. They'd wait for rainstorms and then rush out into the middle of the field so that they could learn to pray in these desolate conditions. They'd fast for weeks at a time, neglecting that the model of fasting Jesus practiced probably didn't include total abstinence from food. They'd stay awake for days at a time, not permitting themselves to sleep, lest in sleeping they missed an opportunity to do good for someone. Eventually, these sorts of practices earned the criticisms not only of the naysaying outsiders, but also of the club members themselves. They found these practices in the end had done little to advance their goal of conformity to Christ's calling. And moreover, they weren't sustainable acts of discipleship. And so the club disbanded, and its members went their own separate ways. But the goal to grow as disciples and to conform to Christ's calling didn't end with the club. Of course, that goal didn't begin with the club either. For centuries, people have heard the call of God toward the promise of a brighter tomorrow, and they have fought, they have struggled, they've died in pursuit of that promise. Some have made great strides. Others have experienced tremendous setbacks. The Epistle of the Hebrews alludes to so many of these stories. A hospitable prostitute, grieving women praying fervently and anxiously for their dead to return to life, government officials and war heroes of ancient Israel, the prisoners, the persecuted, the tortured, the exiled, the desert wanderers. Each one heard the call of God and answered that call. Sometimes to their benefit, sometimes to their ruin. But what matters is that they heard and they responded. The response was, according to the epistle writer, one of faith. They saw the promise of God ahead, and they pursued that promise regardless of their personal outcomes. It's important for us to realize that in the context of contemporary American Christianity. They saw the promise ahead, and they pursued it regardless of their personal outcomes. See, faith isn't a matter of personal outcomes. Faith doesn't belong to us as individuals. Faith is a communal good. We're often tempted to think that faith is how we live into and claim promises that God has for our individual bright futures. Faith will make us healthy and wealthy and wise, if only we can sustain that faith fervently enough. But we don't often hear about having faith enough to allow ourselves to be trampled beneath the feet of jeering crowds, or faith enough to throw ourselves to the wolves. The promises of God, even when made to individuals, are not promises for those individuals. They are promises to build and sustain communities, and so sometimes faith means seeing the promise, realizing it's bigger than you, and sacrificing yourself beneath the wheels of history in order to ensure that the next generation can see that promise coming too. In the book Resident Aliens, authors Stanley Hauerwas and William Willimon describe a conversation they had with their students. They're both college theology professors. And this conversation takes place as conflict begins to erupt between the United States and some Middle Eastern country. I couldn't find the book to confirm the detail there. But the authors, who had both taken stances against this particular conflict, were challenged by the students to describe, well, if we're not supposed to go and fight, what does a Christian response look like to this conflict? The authors suggested that the actual Christian response to the events prompting this conflict would have been to rush into the region, but not as warriors. We'd have gone in with aid. We'd have shown up in person as doctors and nurses and teachers and food suppliers and people there to help rebuild the country from the conflict that we knew was coming. To ensure that these people would not suffer as a result of the choices of their leaders, especially when they get no choice in who the leaders would be. The students balked. They said that kind of response couldn't happen because the United States would never allow its citizens to fly into those places, and those places would never allow U.S. citizens to be on the ground. The authors shook their heads sadly. They agreed that the response could never happen, but they disagreed about why. The authors lamented that as a community, we had lost the faith that would have us entering that country illegally en masse in order to do what Christ called us to do when there are widows and orphans and suffering people in need of help. They despaired we didn't have faith as a community because this was a kind of response no individual can conceive of undertaking on their own. It has to be a work of the community. We didn't have the faith as a community to overcome the obstacle of human law to pursue the calling of Christ. And so our ability to respond in faith was anemic. In our gospel reading today, Jesus acknowledges that the people around him are perfectly capable of reading the weather. The sun means heat. We all know that after the last month. We know clouds mean rain. The challenge is interpreting the times and responding to those times in faith, a response that can often divide the community of Christ from the rest of the community. I can't help but wonder what it looks like for us to respond in faith when the clouds on the horizon suggest conflict is pending in our world too. China and the United States set to square off over Taiwan, Russian spy planes invading airspace around Alaska, Russian war crimes in Ukraine continue to mount, and Ukraine calls for greater military assistance in light of these aggressions. Terrorist organizations rerouting themselves in Afghanistan with so many hotspots and so little sign of de-escalation. We read the signs and it can appear as if some kind of conflict involving our country seems increasingly likely. Now, I admit, I have no special skill in reading the signs, and I have no insight into what will happen in the future. All this may well be just the anxiety of a teacher staring down another school year. But reading the storm clouds on the horizon prompts a question for me. And it's a question I leave us with to wrestle today. It's the question Hauerwas and Willimann's students posed to them: what will a faithful Christian response to all of this look like? Not as individuals, because neither the calling nor the promise are things that we can individually do on our own. Individuals will always be crushed under the weight of these sorts of circumstances. But as a community, hearing the promises of God, we can make a difference by responding in faith regardless of our personal outcomes. So as a community, how will we choose to act to follow Christ's calling to love and serve those whose lives and futures will be so radically disrupted by any conflict? Will we be able to love and serve those who have borne the battle, and their widows and their orphans? Will we be able to stand up to the death-dealing powers and find ways to bring life even to our enemies? Will we be able to find ways to act and love to preserve and sustain the promises of God for those at home in Russia, in Ukraine, in China, in Taiwan, whose circumstances may otherwise call the validity of those promises into question? And will we have faith to seek these promises regardless of the cost to us? What response will we have faith enough to mount if war and conflict comes? I don't know yet. But I hope by God's grace we will rise to the occasion of our calling. Thanks be to God. Amen.